Hoist the black flag high, let the cables hum. Code and cannon ready, futures beating like a drum. Charts are drawn in circuits, treasure maps and AI. We're sailing for the edge where bold ideas never die.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Pirates Only, where we interview top early stage founders on what they're building and how they are going to change the world. And today, I have two incredible founders, Yasir and Matt, co-founders of Aalo Atomics, industrializing everything at the front of the nuclear wave. And I think this podcast is going to be one of my favorites, if only because there is so much talk today on some of the things we'll talk about, certainly with nuclear and energy and data centers. And I don't think there's a better team to have on to talk about that than you guys. So thank you for being here. Do you want to kick things off with maybe just a quick background on both of yourselves, and then we'll go into the founding story of Aalo?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much, Matt, for having us on. You know, we've known you for a while, and you've been a huge help to us over the course of the business. So, you know, thank you for everything you've done for us, including for those who might not know you made our website. So
it's one of my favorites. Yeah.
So pretty beautiful. But yeah, so Yasir and I, we both have a part of the story we want to tell here, and we both kind of got into nuclear from similar but different angles, kind of other sides of the world, both literally and kind of figuratively. So for me, I grew up in Ontario in Canada. First got interested in nuclear because I lived through the coal to nuclear transition. So we had a lot of coal plants. There were like 62 smog days a year. I had pretty bad asthma, and that went away when we turned off all our coal plants and went all in on nuclear. So lo and behold, smog days went to zero. My asthma went away during the teen years when we transitioned off of coal onto nuclear. And so I thought, my God, nuclear is incredible. And so, studied engineering and physics with a specialty in nuclear in university. And then Fukushima happened. And this is where what's interesting, and, Yasir will get into his as well. But for me, I was thinking about starting a nuclear company, but with Fukushima happening, it's like, maybe not the best time to start a nuclear company, but still really wanted to try to do a startup. So taught myself to code, because I thought that'd be something easier to do, as a solo founder to start off with, and did a kind of a 10-year hiatus in software companies. The first one was like a learning experience. The next one we sold for low 9 figures, but around like 2021, the time started to feel right to maybe start the nuclear company. And it still wasn't obvious. We were shutting down gigawatt scale nuclear plants globally. And, I was thinking like, what are the odds we can have success if we can't even keep multi-billion-dollar paid-off assets alive? But it just felt too meaningful not to do. I think Yasir and I both feel like nuclear is the ultimate underdog. It's just insane, the delta between public perception and all the realities of how amazing nuclear really is. And so, started to set out to re-inject myself in the nuclear space. Started by meeting people from my EngPhys program who had all gone into nuclear in Ontario. So OPG, CNSC, Hatch, companies like that. And around 100 people onto that list met Yasir down the chain in the US. And he and I just hit it off instantly. Similar values, similar vision for what nuclear should become, even similar sense of humor, which I think matters when you're spending so much time with someone. And so, the rest has been history. And I think that dovetails nicely into Yasir's background.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, I've heard you tell this story so many times. It's still like, it's fun to listen to. So amazing. It's crazy to be in a podcast with two Matts. So when I say,
You can call me 1T. Just say 1T if you need
1T.
mine. I mean, yep.
Double T.
Just diving into my background here. And again, Matt, thank you for having us over. It's great. This is probably our first podcast where Matt and I are, co-participating together. So thank you for being the first there. I guess my journey in nuclear started when I was very, very young. I grew up in Bangladesh, where we had daily brownouts. Like every day the electricity would go out, and I still remember studying in candlelight most of my, early childhood when I was growing up. On top of that, Bangladesh is one of the most climate vulnerable countries. So, and it's very low lying compared to other countries there. So when the Arctic ice caps melt and you have slight increase in sea levels, it really washes away a significant portion of the land. So the country is shrinking. So by 2040, Bangladesh would lose 50% of its farmland. And that really affected me growing up, these two things. One was electricity shortage. One was, hey, how can we, stop the climate changing so drastically? So from that very young age, I understood two things. One, the world needs a lot of energy, and two, it has to be clean, right? And that was kind of a very personal experience for me growing up. So when I came to the US for college and I went to engineering school, I found out about nuclear, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is one technology that can really tackle both of my childhood curiosities. So nuclear is plenty safe, clean, reliable. It baffled me why we didn't have more of it, right? I mean, granted, 20% of our electricity in the country comes from nuclear, and it's amazing. So right when I was super excited to get full blown, just got, excited to get into the nuclear industry at senior year, Fukushima happened. This was literally a few months before I graduated. And I was like, oh my gosh. And everyone's running away the opposite direction, away from nuclear. And they were going to have this massive renaissance. And then that just tanked completely. And then after that initial shock, I was like, well, actually, if something like this could happen in nuclear, maybe there's a lot more opportunities for change where I can play a role and make an impact. So since then, I've spent 16 years preparing for creating that ultimate nuclear solution, and ended up in that journey designing 5 reactors. This is my 5th reactor design. Went to grad school 4 times, dropped out of 3, read hundreds of books, just to figure out what is that next thing I need to learn to get to the finish line. And all of this, throughout all of that journey, I got to work on some of the best and the cutting edge nuclear programs in the country. AP1000, one of the early SMR programs. And then I started and led the one of the earliest microreactor programs in the US called Evinci. And then right before COVID, it was Marvel. But all of these different programs, I was learning from one to the other just to essentially answer one question, right? How do we mass manufacture nuclear reactors at scale, right? When I was working on the gigawatt scale plant designs, I realized, oh, these are plenty reliable and safe. But where it really sucks is that we can't build fast enough. We need to essentially come up with a different model. So Marvel was the first program that kind of spinned off the bulk of the microreactor industry at a time when nobody thought we can actually build real reactors in short amount of time. So we started off Marvel, and by the time we got the approval from the regulator, it was less than 30 months, less than 3 years. And everybody in the industry was like, how are you guys doing this so fast in a national lab environment? And I led the design for that, and I was very, very proud of the team that we have built there. What really Marvel proved out was that you can still move fast in nuclear and still get regulatory approval. That was the main epiphany in Marvel. And that same lesson and the same DNA we brought over with us when we started off Aalo. But then Marvel also taught us what could not scale. Like, for example, the original fuel that Marvel was using, that was our starting point. But we knew that if we wanted to scale from one reactor to hundreds of reactors, we had to pivot, right? So halfway through the program, I met Matt, and Matt was the 7th entrepreneur who reached out to me saying, hey, everyone's talking about advanced nuclear. You guys are actually building it. And all the previous ones, they were great people, but something was off about some of those individuals. Like either they were not in it for the right reason, or they didn't want to see the right future for nuclear, or they were, we were not complementary in nature. So when I talked to Matt, and I was like, oh my gosh, this guy's great, he's coming from the software world. This is his 3rd company, and he wants to get his vision for what he wants to see in nuclear is very similar to mine. We both loved, good, beautiful aesthetic design. That was another thing we jived on very nicely because, when you look at a nuclear power plant, it looks super scary and you want to just not look at it. What if we created nuclear systems that is so beautiful that people want to have them in people's backyards, and also make it so safe that people won't have to worry about it, right? So
Yeah.
we really jived in many levels, along with the sense that we're extremely complementary. So we do have a lot of overlaps in what we do, but we have a lot of complementary skill sets. And so here we are, 2.5 years in.
which is unbelievable. Yeah, that you've been able to move that fast.
Yeah.
Could you, before we dive in, we'll dive into certainly some of the industry and some of the benefits there, but could you describe or explain in the most layman way possible, what is a nuclear reactor? How does a nuclear reactor work? Because as we go into some of the safety things or why, what's changed over the last decade or two in the space, we kind of need to know, at least at a high level, how does a nuclear reactor work in like the simplest way possible that those for folks that don't know anything about it.
Yeah, totally. No, that's a fun question. So in the most simplest term, a nuclear reactor is not so different than a coal power plant, right? All a nuclear reactor is trying to do is generate heat from splitting atoms instead of combustion, right? And then that heat is taken away from the reactor into a space where we generate steam. And with that steam, you drive a turbine, right? That's essentially it. It's basically a heat generation device using, the power of fission. And for those of in the audience who's not familiar with what fission is, so unlike combustion, where we basically have a fuel and oxygen, they're going through chemical reaction and combining and making CO2 and water, we go into a subatomic level interaction where we're basically sending in a high velocity neutron into a very big atom like uranium, and you hit the nucleus and it basically breaks that nucleus into other pieces. While it does that, it creates 3 more neutrons, and those 3 neutrons can go and hit other uranium atoms, and that essentially can propagate into a self-sustaining chain reaction, right? So a nuclear reactor is basically trying to balance, how do you control that overall cloud of neutrons that's interacting and causing fission. And the nice thing is when you split the atom, you release immense amount of heat. And that's the heat that we try to harness.
Maybe one thing that might surprise people, if you compare what's happening in a nuclear reactor to something like a natural gas plant, coal plant, or even the gas tank of your car, it's kind of like alien technology. Because in the gas tank of your car, for example, you start with a bunch of fuel and you're kind of depleting it, and that's going into the air we breathe. In a nuclear reactor, when the fuel is spent, it actually looks basically the same as when it went in. And yet it magically produced energy for 3 years for, thousands or millions of people. So it really is like this alien technology. And there's a lot of misconceptions because people, sometimes think that when the fuel is spent, it's like a green goo or something. But that's just not the case.
Toxic waste, yeah.
Yeah, so it's really interesting.
Yeah, and if you take all of the used nuclear fuel, we don't even call it a waste in the nuclear industry, right? And you put them together for every commercial nuclear power plant that generated maybe roughly about 20% of the country's electricity from the last 70 years to now, it will all fit in a football field. That's how compact and small it is, and it does not go around in the environment like most people think. It's very well contained. That's one of the biggest myths of nuclear.
It feels like there's so many myths, and one of the questions I definitely wanted to touch on was on the safety side. You guys already mentioned Fukushima. People think of Chernobyl. They think of the toxic goo coming out of the back of a factory and poisoning places. What are some of those misconceptions about nuclear? And then what are some of the biggest changes in safety today that kind of make it so the nuclear is safe? But I think a lot of people, if you were to ask them on the street, would be caught off guard by that. So is it that there's been technological changes that have made that happen? Has it always been a misconception?
Well, I think that the important thing to realize there is nuclear is statistically as safe as solar and wind if you look at the actual stats today. But at the same time, the technology has evolved in the past 75 years. So, for example, in Chernobyl is kind of like a car with no seatbelt. Like it didn't have what's called a containment dome. And so if something went wrong and the design was flawed as well, then there was nothing to contain that issue. The other thing to kind of realize is nuclear has really been mischaracterized as uniquely dangerous. And the interesting thing to kind of look at here is from oil and gas, there's around 2 million premature deaths per year from PM 2.5 particles that go into the air. And in nuclear, there were 42 deaths from Chernobyl immediately, and then maybe a few thousand on the order of, decades later from people in their 80s or 90s passing away slightly early. So, it's even Chernobyl, which is the worst case nuclear accident of all time, is a significantly lower kind of health impact than oil and gas has by orders of magnitude every year.
Every year.
So it's really interesting, the kind of discrepancy in psychology on this whole thing.
Why is that? Why the branding, I guess, then? Was there like an industry movement towards it, or what is the reason why it carried that fear for so long? Because it set
So
back the industry decades.
it seems to be kind of two main things. So there were folks that were anti-nuclear weapons, and they were trying to basically throw the baby out with the bathwater in the 1970s and 80s. And then there was also the oil and gas industry. And, today this might sound like a conspiracy theory, but there is a lot of evidence pointing to, in the 70s and 80s, people in oil and gas trying to cast fear and doubt and uncertainty about nuclear energy. There is some good evidence that happens. It's kind of one of those things. It's kind of like a porcupine quill where, it's easier to go in than to undo that kind of misconception. But I think we are seeing it happen. So in the past 5 or 10 years, there's been an immense amount of pro-nuclear kind of narratives propagating around social media and the press. And that's really helping to right the wrongs of all these misunderstandings that came out in the first atomic age. But I think it'll all get right-sized. And, we're optimists. I think Yasir and I both believe that in the long term, the truth does surface. And the truth is that nuclear in current technology is as safe as solar and wind. And what we're building at Aalo is a mass manufactured, smaller nuclear product, which has even some extra kind of safety characteristics that allow you to mass manufacture it and make nuclear ubiquitous while maintaining that high level of safety.
Yeah. One thing I want to add there is if you really take a step back and you look at the data, the performance data of nuclear power plants, it's actually mind-blowing how, even though despite this few accidents we can name, those were the generation 1 plants when nuclear first started being, producing power, right? Today's nuclear look very, 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 very different from how things were built in the past. So things have evolved significantly. One thing that I want to just throw out there is if you look at the nuclear industry in the United States, the commercial industry, the worst accident was 3 Mile Island, and nobody died out of that accident. And we built nearly 100 plus reactors so far. And if you look at how many nuclear submarines were built, there are more than hundreds of nuclear subs, not a single accident there too. So even though they were first generation systems and people freaked out when 3 Mile Island happened, nobody really died. And it really is such an amazing stats that people don't focus on. If you look at some of the reactors today, one, getting into the technicality of things, how are they different from the first generation and why they're called advanced reactors is because the level of safety they approach is not that the current reactors are not safe. They are very safe. They're very reliable. But what's really different is how that safety is achieved. In the first generation reactors, you would achieve safety by you would rely on the proper actions of humans, and you would rely on a lot of engineered systems in case there are human errors, right? Whereas a lot of the advanced reactors that, like the ones that we are designing today, we don't rely on humans or machines for the safety of the reactor. We rely on the fundamental physics to ensure the safety of the reactor. So the physics ensure it, and there's no force in this world that can go against physics, essentially. So that's how benign some of these advanced reactors look like. And just to give you an example, if you go around the country, there are 20 university research reactors, and they're tucked away in some engineering basement building, right? And we don't worry about day in and day out, what's going to happen? It's the middle of the city. Should I send my kid over there to study? We don't worry about this because those reactors were designed to be so safe that it can be in somebody's basement and it's okay. That's the level of physics-based safety that we're bringing in to our technology as well.
That's one of the things I think I was so surprised of when I first was talking to you guys was how many reactors are already in operation in the United States, and in some cases like college campuses, where you would think that would be the last place that people would want a nuclear reactor. Before we go, we're going to go into kind of some of the more benefits, but at a high level, I think what we're experiencing right now is not only is nuclear becoming safer and all these things, but it's also like a necessity. We need it. It might be the only solution that we have going into the next decade of energy consumption, Could either of you explain maybe a little bit at a high level some of the numbers and demand that we are seeing, particularly with AI data centers, but really just energy consumption demand and requirements that we will need as a whole over the next 5 to 10 years in the United States?
So it's a pretty immense amount of demand that we're seeing. So initially, when we started the company and we kind of decided we'd focus on data centers, the forecast was around 40 gigawatts in the next 5 years in the US alone. Now that's been bumped up to 100. So this is pretty insane. This is like 100 new cities worth of power.
That was going to say, is a gigawatt relative to like a city? Is that kind of the best way people can think about it?
Yeah, roughly, yeah. So,
Yep.
and the really striking thing is if you look at load growth in the US, or really largely in the West, the kind of growth of the total energy generation on the grid, it's really somewhat plateaued, especially in the US in the past couple decades. But now the level of growth you're seeing is surpassing anything that's ever been done before. And the really interesting thing is it's largely from this one type of customer, AI data centers. And the way that they're getting powered today is with a lot of low-hanging fruit natural gas. So there's existing pipeline, existing fracking, and that is now getting tapped out. And so what you're seeing is there's this real scramble, and Jensen and NVIDIA are selling more and more powerful GPUs, power-hungry GPUs each year. And there's going to be this kind of crossover point where in the next couple of years, there's simply not enough available energy to power these GPUs. So you're starting to see a lot of tension where this friction and this tension is causing power prices on the grid to go up. So, locals are not happy about that. You're seeing certain types of energy generation and data centers maybe use a bunch of water for these local communities and so on. And the beauty of nuclear is it's kind of this holy grail solution for these data centers. So if you compare it to renewables, we use 100 times less land. If you compare it to geothermal or hydro, those are very geography constrained, so they only work in some places where there's like magma pocket or fast-moving water. And if you compare it to natural gas, there are a lot of communities that are pretty pissed that the air quality is getting ruined by all these gas turbines. For example, one in Memphis where XAI was going with Elon's work, they brought in these mobile gas generators that skirted air permit laws by being mobile. And the locals were like, what the heck? Like the air is visibly worse. And so with nuclear, it doesn't ruin the air that we breathe, which is a pretty major selling point. So it's almost this counterintuitive thing, which is nuclear is now the answer to NIMBYism instead of causing NIMBYism, because it uses way less land, doesn't poison the air we breathe, and doesn't require water, and is just, works sun or night, windy or not. So it's a really exciting time for nuclear.
Yeah. And in some cases, I know that you've talked about this, where the reactors that you would build on these data centers might even be in excess and then therefore make energy cheaper in some of these communities too. So not only is it safer, not only does it take up less of a footprint, but in many ways in some of these communities, it would end up leading to cheaper energy, which is great.
Yeah.
So it's a win-win-win.
Yeah. There is a bit of a challenging situation that almost all hyperscalers are facing right now. If you think about like the number that Matt just referenced earlier, 100 gigawatt in the next 5 years. Just to think about that for a second.
100 cities. Yeah.
That's 100 Houston worth of electricity, and the grid is not able to handle that. But if you look at all the hyperscalers, they are going and building data centers where there is grid power. Why are they doing that? If the grid cannot handle it, why are they chasing the grid? It's because they want these data centers to run 24/7. They want 99.9% reliability or 5.9 reliabilities that only the grid can provide. So when we are thinking about a solution, a power generation solution for the AI data centers, we're not trying to how can we beat natural gas or some of the other nuclear solutions? We are thinking about okay, how do we really solve the problems of what AI data center companies are facing with the reliability they're looking for as far as their growth is concerned? So, and as a result, our product looks very different from a architecture perspective than any other nuclear solutions, where the plant has 5 small reactors connected to a multiple turbine set. That's kind of a very weird architecture for a power plant. And that's because that configuration alone can give us that N+1 reliability. If one of the reactor is down for maintenance or refueling, the other ones can operate at max power and generate the same amount of electricity. If a turbine is down, there's two other turbines that to back it up. And if you think about that plant and you copy and paste that over a larger area for, let's say, a gigawatt or gigawatt and a half or two, whatever power the data center needs, now all of a sudden, you don't need to rely on the grid to achieve 5.9 reliabilities, right? No technology today can essentially solve that problem the way we can for a firm, clean generation source. So we're not necessarily designing our product to solve the issues of that hyperscalers are necessarily facing today. We are designing for tackling the problems they're going to face in the next 2 to 3 years from in the future, right? So that's a very big deal. I mean, we are a strong believer that there is something that's called a ideal product market fit in nuclear. If we're trying to build a generation device that can make electricity for everybody, we're not making it ideal for anyone. So our product is really looking at what hyperscalers are looking for, what AI data centers are looking for, and making sure that we are solving exactly what their challenges are today.
Yeah. You mentioned this already, but there's definitely a lot of players that are coming into the space to help solve this problem. Could you talk in layman terms? I understand one of the reasons being modular and having the ability to have one turbine or piece of the system go down and still operate. Are those some of the bigger differences between what you guys are building and maybe some of the other competitors? We don't have to name any names, but from a high level, what makes Aalo unique compared to maybe some of the other modular nuclear reactor companies that are starting right now as well?
So maybe just to carry the baton from where Yasir said there,
Yeah.
is we really fundamentally believe that product market fit is a very real thing in nuclear. And the challenge is a lot of other nuclear companies started 5, 10, 15 years ago, and they designed their product for fundamentally different markets. And so, you might have started maybe around 2010. And that time, again, Yasir and I already spoke to it about how Fukushima had just happened. That was an anti-nuclear era. And so for them, they said, well, the only way to get social license to build our technology is if we can use nuclear waste as the fuel. But doing that requires a special fuel that's a higher level of enrichment. And the supply chain for that fuel is called HALEU. It was from Russia. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, that supply chain went away and that decision became stale. So if you're trying to power 100 Houstons, to Yasir's point, with a fuel supply chain that doesn't exist, that is not a good product market fit, right? And then similarly, let's say you started maybe 5, 6 years ago, again, before data centers were growing, you might have thought, okay, the best way to market is remote diesel military, right? The military could help you maybe go faster. And so the best product for the military for a forward deployed base is a very small reactor, very expensive, using a very special form of fuel that, again, is very low supply chain. For example, it's called TRISO. And so TRISO is inherently more expensive and will lead to higher LCOEs. And, is that a good fit for remote diesel military? Yeah, that's a great product market fit. But that is not the right product for data centers. Basically, what it boils down to is we almost have this advantage in having started a bit later and timing things and really focusing on making the best product for data centers from the beginning, because we could do what a startup is meant to do, which is go talk to customers and ask what they want and design around that. And so that's kind of how we've been able to make this holy grail product for data centers.
Yeah. So coming back to your question, Matt, is how are we different? And it's going to tie nicely with where Matt ended, is if you think about the overall spectrum of nuclear today, you basically have gigawatt scale plants that usually takes about 10 plus years to build in the West today. And then
That would be to power a city, basically.
Exactly. And that is all mostly built as a project on the site, mostly a stick build approach. And that takes a very long time. And that relies on the technology of the past, right? And then there's another category called micro reactors. Those are the, single digit megawatt level, like 1 to 5 megawatt perhaps. And those are mostly good solutions for remote power supply, right? For remote communities or mines.
Military base, like
military
Matt said.
bases, applications. But then there's a You have the small modular reactor, which a lot of people heard about. But if you look around, there are no small modular reactors being built today because they're neither small nor are they very modular. They're basically one third the size of gigawatt scale reactors. And as Matt was saying, these were built or designed, not built. They were designed in an era where they were having challenges with financing this really gigawatt scale plant. So they wanted to make it smaller. It is not an ideal fit for AI data centers. So when we looked around and said, you know what is that unit block of data center power source that would be ideal that we can copy paste the way data centers copy and paste into a larger data center? What does that look like? Then we came up with the 50 megawatt pod. But the next challenge was, well, if there are 5 reactors in each pod, what should those 5 reactors be made out of? What is that ideal technology we should be selecting? So most small reactors, they suffer from not being economically feasible. They're very expensive. It works in remote areas, but when you think about, you're trying to compete with power on the grid, you have to make sure it's economically feasible. So we put a lot of effort and thinking trying to figure out what is that ideal technology that we can build in a factory, that we can transport in modular fashion, but is also have a very superior economics, right? And the two of the most important element of that tech choice is, one is our fuel selection. We don't use any exotic fuel that does not exist today commercially. We use commercially available uranium dioxide fuel that does not use HALEU, where maximum is 8% enrichment, right? That is commercially available today. When we build hundreds of reactors, we don't have to worry about where the fuel is going to come from because that supply chain exists in the US. That's one key unlock. The second unlock was our choice of coolant. So most reactors that you find commercially today are based on water-based technology. And if you want to get high temperature out of it, you have to pressurize the heck out of that vessel so it can operate high temperature without turning into vapor, right? And that's why all of these systems are made with very thick walls to be even containing that pressure. So we decided not to have any pressurized system whatsoever. So we selected a coolant that can operate at high temperature without turning into a gas. So instead of water, we use liquid metal. And in our case, it's sodium. And sodium is an amazing coolant. We have a lot of experience from previous prototype reactors built in this country and everywhere around the world. It's 100 times more thermally conductive than water. And the chemistry between sodium and structural steel is so good that you can run for decades without having any chemical issues. And so from a compatibility perspective, it's really awesome. And that is, to me, the biggest unlock of what enables us to build our reactors in a factory is with a non-pressurized coolant, everything is thin-walled. So instead of using forging that can take 2 to 4 years for a pressure vessel, we can make our vessels like the one behind Matt in a matter of 2 weeks in our factory here, right? So that's a huge game changer for everything that we're doing on the tech side. So I think, while most small reactors are like, oh, well, it's too expensive, I'm going to go in remote areas or military base, who's going to pay me higher for the energy? We're not doing that. We're coming up with a solution that initially is going to be within the range that hyperscalers are willing to pay today. But once we make hundreds of these and we can come down the cost curve, it can open up other markets like, industrial sector, desalination, or small towns and municipalities. And then one day, when we can get it down to even lower cost per energy, it's going to be even more competitive than natural gas, or like close to
be in neighborhoods.
And so that one day we can actually provide power to any countries that are struggling with power and bring them out of energy poverty as well as real poverty, right?
Yeah,
That's
that's incredible.
goal.
I love that. One of the things that a lot of people are excited about right now, the Department of Energy created a program which essentially elected or nominated a bunch of companies to and challenge themselves to go critical by our country's birthday later this year in July. Could one of you talk a little bit about what that is, why it's important, and then maybe some how Aalo fits into that?
Yeah, totally. Maybe I can start with that. If you think about, so last year, President Trump, after he took office, he said, okay, we've done a lot of paper reactor designs. It's time to build something real. So there was an executive order that basically said, I want 3 reactors to achieve criticality by July 4th of this year, which is America's 250th birthday. Very monumental historical year. And so most of the industry was like, well, that's not how nuclear works. It takes a long time. Majority of them kind of like backed out from the whole approach. Only a few applied, including Aalo. And we were like, well, one of our moat and our strength in Aalo is the fact that we are the fastest company in nuclear. What better way to demonstrate that than this mission? And by the time when Aalo got selected for this program, we only had 10 months to pull this off, right? But just to back up a little bit, Aalo is only a 2.5 years company. And, it was just me and Matt in late 23 when we started off. We're 150 people right now. And since then, we have built our factory right behind me here, 40,000 square feet, 6 months after we put the team together. And when we started the reactor pilot program, we took 36 days to build our first nuclear reactor building. We took 4 weeks to build the reactor itself in the factory and 1 week to install it. So in an industry where it takes many, many years or decades, that's the norm, we're essentially flipping the script and saying, can we do that in less than 1 year? And we're demonstrating that, right? So I think that's an amazing opportunity for us as a company to show what our speed looks like. And this year is kind of an interesting year because, a lot of great things are happening. Like, for example, Artemis 2 just sent astronauts around the moon after like over nearly 50 years, since the last time. And if you think about if, they're trying to solve the issues on the moon, and here in the desert of Idaho, bless you, man. In the deserts of Idaho, we're building, the first new nuclear facility in over 50 years, trying to unlock energy abundance on Earth. So it's kind of a very historical year where we're heading towards.
So in our estimation, there are 3 other companies that will achieve criticality by July 4th. But what we are doing is really apples and oranges compared to what everyone else is doing. So if you look at those 3 other companies, they are respectively doing a 1 megawatt, 500 kilowatt, and 100 kilowatt test reactor.
Those are what Yasir was saying earlier, the micro reactor kind of space.
Yeah. Whereas we're doing a 10 megawatt, full-scale system, initially 0 power criticality, and then going to full power operation soon thereafter. So, ours is really the only one that's actually commercially relevant, kind of, full scale, all the fuel, all the controls. And then also 2 of the others are actually going into existing buildings. We had to build our own building from scratch because this is our whole model. We want to show that, like Yasir said before, nuclear can be licensed quickly, built quickly from a green field. So I think this is insane if you consider that, where we're actually turning this reactor on in a matter of just a few weeks, it was a green field just a few months ago. And we built this whole building, did all the policies, procedures, and, security controls, operations procedures from scratch. And doing it so quickly, so efficiently while maintaining safety is a huge deal. And one more thing is in a very capital efficient way. In fact, as a whole company, we've actually only spent around 70 million so far to not only go to criticality, but also build a factory that can actually produce these modules. So that I think that is unheard of. If you ask people 3 years ago whether that was possible, they'd say, it'll take you $1 billion to get to criticality, 10 years. And in fact, many investors laughed when we said we'd achieve criticality on this timeline, but we're doing it. So we're really proud of that.
Yeah.
That's a huge feat.
One thing I want to add to what Matt is saying is, I think if of all the companies that we project to achieve criticality, including Aalo, I think we took the most difficult scope, the largest scope to get to that line. And that is because vertical integration is a key part of our company, right? We designed the entire building, the entire reactor, all the control systems, all the shielding material, reactor vessels, all of it. Our team designed it, built it, they're testing it, then we'll operate it. We're not bringing in operators from other places. all of the different, so building the reactor in itself is half the challenge. The other half of the challenge is creating all of the safety management programs that is needed to prove to the regulator, hey, the way Idaho National Laboratory next door is operating as a DOE contractor, Aalo can also be a DOE contractor. So the amount of work was like a ton. And the reason we did that is because we want to build that muscle so we can do a lot of these things in-house, because we're not worried about just building one reactor. We're thinking about, okay, after this one, we're going to build a full powered system next door, and we want to do vertical integration on that as well. After that, build hundreds of reactors and scale it up. And that's where the rubber meets the road. If we just do a small scope just to achieve criticality, that's pointless in our mind.
It's almost as though, a lot of folks might be looking at this criticality test as the finish line. In a way, you're looking at it as like the starting line. It's like, as soon as that gun goes off, we've done that, we've reached that milestone. That's actually where the next phase of work begins, which I think is what makes Aalo so exciting. Could you paint a little picture on what that scale actually looks like? What does that timeline actually look like? So if you do hit criticality and up to or before July, what happens after July for Aalo?
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a day to celebrate and cry and high five.
Yeah.
But right after that, the focus immediately turns to basically turning our Aalo X site into the world's first co-located and co-built nuclear plant and data center. So we do have a partner that was announced on a podcast. It's Crusoe. They're one of the two main developers behind Stargate. And they're going to be putting a data center right next to this power plant we're building at the Aalo X site. So that'll be the immediate next step. In parallel, we are now about to build out our 1 million square foot factory. And this will be our gigawatt factory.
1 million square foot.
1 million square feet, yes. It's called a gigawatt factory, not to be confused with a gigafactory. These are totally different things. But it'll have the capacity to produce 100 reactors a year, totaling a gigawatt per year, and then we'll scale it up from there. But we think roughly that's the ratio. So like Yasir said, what we're creating here is fundamentally a new nuclear product. So if you think about nuclear, what hasn't existed before is affordable smaller reactors. You started off with smaller reactors that were expensive because they were the first time humanity built nuclear in the 1950s. And then we made nuclear cheaper by making it bigger. We built big reactors that were actually as cheap as coal in the 1970s. And then, unfortunately, we forgot how to build them. So now we're making expensive big reactors like Vogtle. But there's two main ways to make something cheap, right? You can make it bigger or make it more numerous. And in nuclear, we've never made it cheaper in that latter methodology, like making it more numerous. So that's what we're doing. And the beauty, and Yasir already touched on this, is that unlocks all these markets that were just not accessible to nuclear before, like things like desalination, industrial process heat, small utility. They don't want a gigawatt. They want 10 to 100 megawatts. But if you tell them you're going to be, 15 cents, 20 cents, 30 cents a kilowatt hour, they say, come back and talk to us when you're below 10 cents. So that's the whole beauty of what we're doing is the hyperscalers have a slightly higher willingness to pay, not too much, but slight. And that opens the door just enough to start to come down the cost curve in our factory and then go after all those other markets. So, and like Yasir said, the ultimate goal is to go after developing nations, help bring the world out of energy poverty. So that's our kind of top secret master plan.
I love it.
Those 3 steps. But
yeah, Matt and I, we have a habit of not pushing out timeline, but bringing it closer.
Yeah.
Our original plan was by 2028, we will unleash this gigawatt factory where we can build hundreds of reactors a year in this 1 million square feet facility. We looked at each other and we're like, that's too long. Let's bring that backwards. Now, so we are really, basically approaching the gigawatt factory in 3 phases. The first phase is going to be this year. From this 40,000 square feet, which, by the way, is not a factory, really, if you think about it. It's not an assembly line. It's basically, this is the place where we try to figure out how to build our reactors and build the first couple of them, right? But to truly unlock what Henry Ford has done in cars, we need to build our first assembly line. And that we're doing this year in the phase 1 of the gigawatt factory, where we're getting like about 250,000 square feet just to make sure we can make multiple Aalo pods and tens of reactors a year, learn from it, do as much vertical integration as we can. And then from that learning, we'll go to phase 2 next year, which is let's go maximize vertical integration. And then phase 3 would be up to the 1,000,000 square feet, where we're maximizing the production out of that massive factory space here in Texas. So yeah, we're super excited about it. And one of the biggest challenges in the nuclear industry, particularly advanced reactor, is the lack of a robust and reliable supply chain.
Yeah.
We know that, hey, we call ourselves a vertical integration company, and we build all the things that nobody else builds in our reactor, but there are common commodities like pumps and turbines or sensors that we will still need to buy from others. So we've been working very closely with more than 140 suppliers across 35 states and 6 countries, bringing in 100,000 plus people's brains together, trying to make sure that when we scale from one reactor to hundreds of reactors a year, there's an entire industry and ecosystem that scales with us. So we're not just saying, hey, let's just go and grow Aalo to the max and leave everybody behind. We are actually helping other companies grow and really rebuilding that muscle that US have lost in building large scale, numerous amount of reactors that we used to be able to do in the past.
It's incredible. I think I want to touch on 2 kind of things in more layman ways there. I think what gets me really excited about what you're doing is you mentioned volume and producing some of these at scale, but then I also think what maybe a lot of folks listening don't quite understand is that the 10 to 15 megawatt reactor is also, 10 times bigger than some of the micro reactors that are looking to do the same type of scale. So you guys are kind of in this middle ground of being able to not only produce at a high scale, but reactors that are also a multiple bigger than some of the other companies that are coming through as well.
Yeah, one of the goals that we had internally when we were designing our reactor was, yes, it should be factory manufactured. Yes, it can be transported by road as a module. But what is that technology that can give us the highest power that we can put on the back of a truck?
Yeah.
That was our design.
Work backwards from that almost.
Exactly.
Yeah. And also to dive into one thing Yasir touched on earlier, why sodium? So Yasir mentioned it's low pressure, high boiling point. That means thin walled vessels, easier to roll. So that's a big advantage. But also it's 100 times more thermally conductive than any other nuclear coolant, water, molten salt, or gas. And so what that means is the vessels can then be 2 to 5 times smaller for the same energy. And if you're really thinking about, doing for nuclear what Henry Ford did for cars, you got to make sure that you're optimizing for the most compact, most mass manufacturable system, because it makes a big difference on the economics when you can make 2 to 5 times more revenue with the same amount of hardware. So that's what a lot of other designs might struggle with.
I think ultimately what we're solving here is how to scale nuclear in a way that we haven't before. Yeah, we can go to build a gigawatt scale plant one at a time, and it takes a decade at a time to build. Ultimately, the solution that we are trying to bring to life is we can make multiple gigawatts from a factory built system every single year. And if you think about what is the model that can get us to 100 Houston's worth of power in the future, this is the only scalable way of achieving that, not how we have done things in the past where we stick build every single system from ground up.
Yep. Maybe the last question here, you mentioned obviously down the road, this is something that on a global level could bring people out of energy poverty. Could you paint a picture at what that would actually mean? Both internationally, but also here in the US, what does this utopia kind of look like? What does it actually unlock at a global level when you achieve this?
Well, I feel like, Yasir and I both have lots of thoughts on this. I think one way to frame the question is kind of, what do we help to enable and what do we help to avoid? So
I like that.
One thing is it's pretty incredible that the whole global economy right now is propped up on oil and gas. And this is like dead plants and dinosaurs that will only last us like another 100 years. So all of civilization is propped up on this thing that's going to run out in 100 years. We have to, we're driving 1,000,000 miles an hour towards a brick wall, and nuclear is the answer. So, nuclear is going to save us from that because It's clean. Not only will it not mess up the planet, but also it'll last us millions of times longer because nuclear is way more energy dense. There's way more fissile and fertile fuel around the Earth than there is oil and gas. So there's that. But the kind of positive framing of that is, think about all the wealth and well-being that oil and gas has brought us. As much as people like to hate on it, it brought us an incredible quality of life, a lot of wealth, a lot of well-being. Imagine multiplying that by millions. What does that look like? I'm not even going to sit here and pretend to imagine all the incredible things that can be unlocked by a million times more energy abundance. So that's a huge angle. And then the other side is AI. Like right now, AI is a little bit controversial. Some people think it's going to unlock the utopia for humanity. Some people think it'll be a Terminator scenario. At Aalo, we're optimists. We really believe that it's going to be this bright, optimistic future, and we want to enable that. But just thinking through what AI can do for humanity, it can solve disease. It can solve some fundamental big problems that humanity has, like poverty. It can create abundance for everyone. It could, in theory, do things like do vertical farming to return a lot of the farmland back to nature and kind of allow us to create more humans, but then also be better for the planet, return nature back to the planet. Anyway, Yasir probably has some good ones too.
Yeah, no, beautifully said, Matt. I think what I would want to compliment with that is, if you think about the world today, there's developing nations who don't have the capability to essentially make their own power. They're reliant on other countries to import the energy. And then if you look at developed nations like the US, we're looking at, energy security as a big deal, right? So almost everybody wants abundant energy for one reason or another, right? But that's great. I mean, we're creating an energy generation technology, but ultimately, if you take a step back and if you look at Earth, right? And there's a lot of people that are super excited about exploring other planets and settling humanity there, which is awesome, great. But if you look at Earth itself, there's so many untapped potential. 50% of the population live in only 3% of the land. And that's because there's a lot of areas on planet Earth that are uninhabitable. Either they're too dry
Off
or
the grid,
too wet, or they don't have access to the national grid. But with this energy solution, Matt and I have this vision that, one day perhaps with our systems, you can unlock all of these uninhabitable places and make them habitable.
That's cool.
And then really allow humanity to grow and foster on this planet before we even think about embarking on another one. So that's what we can unlock here, ultimately, is make uninhabitable places habitable with nuclear.
I love it. You guys, this was awesome. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that folks are even more excited about what you're building now after listening to this. We'll put some links, obviously, in the show notes. Folks can continue to follow both of you and Aalo. But thank you again for being on, and we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good.
Thanks so much for having us, Matt.
Thanks
Have
for
a good
having
one.
us. Yeah, you too.
Hoist the black flag high, let the cables hum. Code and cannon ready, futures beating like a drum. Charts are drawn in circuits, treasure maps and AI. We're sailing for the edge where bold ideas never die. Pirates only.